Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. Happy to be here. Happy New Year to everybody. It's an exciting time to talk about space in general. Throughout the globe, it's an exciting time to talk about it in the context of NATO in terms of security, the advancements in technology that are taking place across the board, civilian, military, scientific. It just makes it the right topic now to talk about across the board, but particularly here at NATO. As you know, NATO has gotten a lot of attention in the last year in a way it hasn't previously, unfortunately, as a result of Russia's ongoing invasion in Ukraine, but it's put NATO back on the map. And so while people are paying attention to NATO, it's an opportunity to also pay attention to what we have been doing and what we are doing in space. As Major Grunert mentioned, I focus on space policy here at the U.S. mission to NATO headquarters. Previously taught space policy at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, where Major Grunert is currently stationed. And so I've had the opportunity to look at it from an academic perspective as well as from a practical one here in Brussels. I have to say that the speed at which things are moving, both in terms of the technological capabilities and just the overall thinking in space, is impressive across the board, especially within the U.S. government, military, and civilian. And so it's been exciting to go from that academic into the practical environment. What I want to do is very, very briefly explain a little bit about NATO. It might help folks. As I mentioned, we've gotten a lot of attention in the news lately, but for a lot of folks, it's a bit of a mystery, or at least people know some broad strokes, and it's a political military alliance, but beyond that, most don't really give it much thought or haven't really been exposed to it. So to begin with, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an alliance of 30 allies. We have a number of partners, two of which are labeled as invitees. We're hoping Finland and Sweden will be joining us as allies very soon. The crux of NATO is Article 5, the mutual defense aspect of the Washington Treaty, which basically says an attack on one is an attack on all. The alliance has grown from its original membership to its present count of 30, and hopefully soon 32. And with that growth, there has been an evolution in the scope of topics that are addressed here within the alliance headquarters. Of course, when it was first founded, the goal was to be prepared to confront Russia in the heart of Europe. But now we understand that there are all manner of security risks that threaten us as allies that range from climate change to critical infrastructure, underwater pipelines, underwater communication lines. And we need to begin to focus on how these also interact with each other. So to that end, we adopted space as one of the domains, the traditional air, land, and sea. We incorporated cyberspace and then space as areas that NATO was going to focus on as exclusive domains, but also interrelated. And so that brings us to the space conversation at NATO. So again, it's dynamic, it's rapidly evolving. That's not news to anybody that's on this call, because you have been tracking it, you've been watching it in your own space, whether it's academia, from the commercial aspect, from security and defense. What we have come to understand is the critical nature of space to alliance defense and deterrence. What I mean by that is it isn't necessarily about defending from attacks from space necessarily, but the assets we have in space do lend themselves to the peace and prosperity of each of the allies, whether that be GPS navigation, which is critical for both tracking positions of troops and vessels, aircraft of both allies and potential adversaries, but also the e-commerce that makes our societies function. And so we began to think about what does resilience look like? What does protection of assets look like? And how can we make sure that we have redundancies and these sort of protections in place to continue to defend our citizens? We, of course, collectively are an enormous populace, over or about 1 billion people covered on both sides of the Atlantic. So this can range from weather monitoring, environment and agriculture, transportation, science, communications, and as I mentioned, banking and e-commerce. It does not have to mean kinetic military engagements in space. It's as much about, as I said, defense and deterrence as it is about anything else. A quick history of space at NATO. For a long time, NATO did operate a number of satellites that were used for some of these purposes, and as I said, terrestrial monitoring and the like. But in 2019, at the summit in London of the heads of state and government, NATO declared space to be its fifth operational domain. And Jeremy, I just asked you to move forward to, I skipped over 1 or 2 slides. If you could just move to, so as you can see from the slide in front of you now, in 2019 through 2022, things have gotten very active here. And I think that that's a reflection of a lot of thinking that was taking place prior to those events that really sort of culminated. As we all know, things have been moving rapidly in space. So in 2019, as I mentioned, we declared space an operational domain to join the traditional air, land, sea, and then we recently added cyberspace as well. What happened thereafter is we established a NATO Space Center the following year. It's based out of Ramstein in Germany. It supports NATO operations. It conducts space situational awareness. What it does is it gathers information from the allies and provides it, disseminates it in a way that is usable at the individual or alliance-wide level. One piece about terminology when discussing NATO, by the way, you'll often hear allies in the alliance or allies and NATO used interchangeably. And that's a bit of a misnomer. The alliance is one thing. And when you talk about NATO doing something, that's one thing. When we talk about allies doing something, that is often on an individual national basis. And space is a perfect example because NATO does not possess, it has no plans to possess any of its own inherent space capabilities or assets. It relies on allies to contribute to the alliance needs. And the Space Center is a perfect example of that in space. So in 2021, there was renewed attention to space and what that can mean for the security of the allies and the alliance. And that came as a result of the November Russian anti-satellite test that was a debris field that was so disruptive that in fact astronauts and cosmonauts were prepared for evacuation from the International Space Station. There was a very strong statement that came out. And again, this is a moment to pause and share with you briefly that everything at NATO is done by a unanimous consent. Consensus is the standard here. So that can mean that things are difficult at times to get agreement amongst 30 different allies with sometimes different perspectives on an issue of immediate concerns such as an anti-satellite test. But whenever we agree, it is that much more forceful because it has been agreed by every single person. There's no question that any action taken by NATO, statement issued by NATO, is not wholeheartedly endorsed by every single ally. So by making this statement, we began to see down a marker regarding Russia's behavior. And I'll get to the issues of responsible behavior in space in a moment, but this was certainly outside the norm given the recklessness of its behavior, and it only went to show, the disregard that Russia had for international standards and norms. So in 2021, we also established what was called the NATO Space Center of Excellence. NATO has a system of centers of excellence that are hosted by individual allies that cover a range of topics from counterterrorism to cyber to space, in this case, located in Toulouse, France. And the idea here is, again, to have a locus in which allies can bring ideas, can do training, can explore through academic research different areas that pertain to space, security, and defense. So this is just yet another commitment of assets by, in this case, NATO as well as France, in conjunction with participating allies. The importance of space and how the allies recognize that it's important to continue to think about this topic and to continue to evolve and develop strategies and even tactics to deal with space security, deterrence, and defense. In 2022, NATO released its overarching space policy. This was a public document. You can search it online, and it talks about what NATO expects to pursue in terms of overarching policy towards space, to look at how we can support our missions, how we can support our operations, how we can bring some of these assets of the allies into the alliance to support communications, navigation, intelligence, and other aspects of the security, deterrence, and defense of the alliance. And then finally, the 2022 strategic document. This is a hard-fought, hard-negotiated document that spells out NATO's vision for a future period of about 10 years. It looks at what we're seeing now, what we anticipate in the future. These can be revolutionary documents in which we move the alliance very much from the past to the present, moving into the future. And for the 2022 strategic concept, we incorporated space into alliance strategic thinking for the first time. This was critical for a lot of developments. This is also a publicly available document, but not only recognizing space as an important domain, but beginning to encapsulate it into our strategic thinking, meaning adding it to exercises, adding it to training and education, as I mentioned, through the Center of Excellence and other institutions here within NATO. It's a major step forward to make the alliance ready for the needs of the future. So what's particularly interesting to most people about NATO, and one of the things that they're most familiar with, is the famous Article 5, one for all for one, an attack on one is an attack on all. So, of course, many will recall that this has only been invoked once in the history of the alliance, following the September 11th attacks on the trade towers in Pennsylvania and on the Pentagon. And so what's interesting to most people from a historical perspective is everyone assumed it would be invoked by attacking Europe and bring America in, but in this case, it was an attack on the United States that brought the best out of the alliance. And so, as you can see, here's a quote that comes from the 2021 Brussels Summit, in which NATO leaders declared that attacks that have a nexus with space, attacks to, from, or within space, could lead to the invocation of Article 5. Now, there's no magic formula, there's no magic trigger to what would be Article 5. We assembled the allies at what's called the North Atlantic Council, that's the NAC, and these issues are debated. That's what happened after September 11th. But it's an important recognition because once you invoke a new domain, you have to understand what it means. And in the traditional domains, right, air, land, and sea, an invasion that caused shooting match between tanks or between airplanes or at sea would be pretty clear. But cyber is less clear. Space is less clear. You have issues of intent. You have issues of attribution. And so it's very important that this be articulated so that we could at least communicate to the world that this is something we're thinking about taking seriously, to put the world on notice that the fact that it's hard doesn't mean that we're not prepared to address it. So beyond the allies, NATO is an ideal forum for talking about security, defense, norms of behavior, not in terms of setting norms. NATO is not a norm-setting institution, and it doesn't want to be. But if you look at it, partly out of coincidence, partly out of the fact that we bring like-minded, democratic, free societies together, we are the perfect forum to talk about space. You think about, we have the United States, we have allies, we have partners, such as Japan, such as the United Arab Emirates, such as Israel, that play a major role in space. And many of those allies and partners are signatories to the Artemis Accords. And so this is envisioning greater human presence, permanent human presence on the moon, in space, beyond, which will of course require security and protection. And so if you think about it, we've created by accident over these many years of training and cooperation and discussion, we've created a forum, not the only one by all means, a forum in which we can have really, really comprehensive discussions, and through our actions, we can support the efforts of other meaning-setting institutions like the United Nations for responsible behavior in space. So through practice, conversation, and agreement here, we can support these other efforts that are important to that security, that deterrence, that defense in outer space. And so, I would say that, when you look at who's not on the list, what you see are those actors that are also engaged in space, but in a more malign or at least questionable fashion. So you have, China and Russia developing capabilities such as the ASAT test that we saw Russia engage in November 2021. And you say you're outside of this broad forum of countries that can discuss this. And so the hope is that as they are more and more marginalized through their actions, or they see others marginalized through their actions, that this helps to encourage a more responsible standards of behavior in space that will help in the deterrence and defense of other activities that can lead to unintended consequences. I mean, small accidents in space can have grave consequences, and even though ASAT tests to date have largely been for defunct and decommissioned satellites, they do create debris fields that can have knock-on effects that can put different countries' assets and in the future citizens at risk. And so this is the sort of thing that we would have to consider, again, getting back to the questions of attribution, intent, and so forth. So it's important that we continue to communicate in private here within the alliance, in public, and in conjunction with not just allies and partners, but other institutions that are discussing these issues. So NATO's space policy that I mentioned, it identifies 4 key roles for NATO in space and 9 lines of effort. I haven't listed them all here, but one of them is space support, space domain awareness, deterrence, defense, and resilience. And I'll mention resilience again, because this is really a cross-cutting aspect of what we're doing here in NATO. We saw the attack, the sabotage, the incident on the gas pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline recently. And this is the sort of thing that we want to make sure that we have a way to recover from, to either prevent, recover from, and create redundancies and backup systems. And so space is one of those places where there isn't really a margin of error. It's not like sending a fire truck or an ambulance down the street. So we want to make sure that we have resilience built into some of our strategic and tactical thinking in space. We want to develop capabilities, and we want them to be interoperable. As I mentioned, NATO is an ideal clearinghouse for the developed, democratic, free societies that are engaged in space, both allies and partners, and we invite all nations to share in this process, and we want to make sure that they're all interoperable, just as we do with land, sea, maritime, and cyber. As I mentioned before, training and exercises. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, space would not have been included in the training and exercise. Reason was because we didn't have a dedicated space force in the United States. Many of our allies are developing space forces branches of their own. That there wasn't really a conceptual framework for how you would inject the space element into a training exercise. But again, through the planning, through the discussion, through the thinking, the partnership with private enterprise, partnership with academia, we have been able to envision various scenarios that we can bring into our training, such as GPS jamming, satellite destruction, even or disturbance or interference. And so these are all being integrated into the training, the exercises, the planning, and the thinking here at NATO, which is again designed principally to protect our citizens, protect our peace, protect our prosperity. prosperity as societies. So strategic communications as well. I mean, we need to make sure that we communicate clearly what we plan to do, what we expect of others, and that statement about the possibility of Article 5 coming from something that originates in, passes through, or goes to space or within space is an important part of that. Transparency is critical. Strategic communications is a big part of what we do at NATO to ensure that across all lines of effort here at the Alliance, we make sure people understand what we mean, how we mean it, and what our intentions are, what our responses will be, so that there's no room for misunderstanding that can lead to escalation or miscalculation. You know, if you don't think there's going to be a response and you are an adversary, you may attempt to do something that could cross the line. When those strategic communication plans are developed and expressed, you can avoid that misunderstanding, which could lead to miscalculation, which can lead to escalation. And that's what we're seeking to avoid in space, because it's such a new domain of activity with poorly established norms of behavior, or at least not fully agreed norms of behavior. Of course, science, technology, and innovation. As I said, we look to protect the peace and prosperity of allies and allied citizens. And so that comes down to, again, being able to develop assets, deploy those assets, utilize those assets in ways that you might not even imagine today. When GPS was developed for the military many, many years ago, people didn't think you would be taking out a GPS receiver on your phone in your pocket. But those have the ability to trickle out into our daily lives in inaccurate ways, and we want to encourage that. We want to encourage the innovation that goes into space defense and security, also has civilian commercial applications. And that applies also to industry. As I mentioned before, we talk to private industry, we talk to academia to get their ideas, and that extends to the various space related space adjacent industry. One of the things that's really important to us, as I mentioned, is monitoring of conditions, so that when we do training and different circumstances here on Earth or eventually in space, we're able to have situational awareness in real time, be able to know what's happening. And so industry and private sector in general is really, really critical to that, because they're developing some of the most revolutionary things. If you told us 10 years ago that NASA would be resupplying the International Space Station through a private company, I think a lot of people would have thought that that was a little bit far-fetched. And now it comes standard fare, and there's a lot of players in that space doing niche work that is quite revolutionary. So, as I mentioned, partnerships, because we have partnerships outside of the Alliance. We also have partnerships, again, with various institutions that contribute to that, the development of our thinking and understanding, because in the private sector, in academia, there's just a pace of development that is almost dizzying. And so we want to make sure that we are constantly being fed that and making it part of a dialogue with these different institutions, that we can share with them what we're thinking, we can get feedback from them. And again, we are stronger because at 30 allies plus many, many partners with huge resources behind them in terms of their private sectors, their academic resources, and their innovative capacities. And we really are the leading edge of what's happening in space collectively. So I'll move on to the last slide and just reiterate what I said before. Russia and China have very well developed space programs. There are others who are doing things that have space related concern. We've seen other countries that have sought to develop anti-satellite capabilities. For example, of course, there are countries developing ballistic missile technology, which of course could reach orbit. We have to be aware of what they're doing. One, so we can engage in that strategic communication, let them know we know what they're capable of, and we are monitoring it to avoid any sort of escalation, miscalculation, but also to provide the room for responsible behavior. within the global community of spacefaring nations with access to space. But we also want to discourage behavior that we're already seeing. And like I said, in November 2021, anti-satellite tests that caused such a dangerous field of debris, endangering again astronauts and cosmonauts. The problem there is, what do we do to encourage repetition of such behavior? So as I said, communication, a strong NAC statement is hopefully effective and hopefully is heard by others. It doesn't have to just be directed at Russia for others to hear what the Atlantic Council said about that. Others should be able to take that to heart and realize that it's not going to win them any favors within the international community. So overall, we are aware of the developing capabilities. We are aware, clearly, given what NATO is doing in Ukraine, the threat it poses, we understand challenges that the People's Republic of China poses. We know that there are other actors out there, and we have to continue to remain vigorous and innovative, because what is novel technology today could be standard fare tomorrow. Within our lifetimes, we saw the advent of drones that are now essentially purchased on Amazon off the shelf and to be utilized in various ways. So by non-state actors. So we really have to keep working together. We need to continue to monitor space's domain, what the capabilities are, what the threats may be, and how we can bring allied and partner assets into a conversation to be prepared for those, or even deter those potential threats. So I just want to pause it here. I think we're sort of at the halfway mark. I was hoping this would be a little bit of a dialogue, and so I want to make sure that I do offer time for questions. I can say more, but I think that that's enough of an overview, and I hope it was helpful to those who listened and standing by.
Wonderful, sir. Well, thank you so much for that phenomenal presentation. We really appreciate it. And we have gotten some questions that are flowing into our Q&A box. So, sir, first we've got a couple of questions from Kees van Haperen. First question is, sir, thank you for your presentation. Recently completed my LLM at the University of Nottingham with a dissertation on the international legal ramifications of NATO declaring space as an operational domain.
I'd love to read that.
And so the question is, I wondered, as the OST, right, the Outer Space Treaty, is considered customary law for NATO, would it not be beneficial for NATO and its members if it would sign the treaty, especially it could then be recognized as a space international organization and actively contribute to the development of new soft law through, for instance, proactive participation internationally with various state behaviors? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and we could have an entire presentation on that. We could have an entire course on that, depending on the environment. So again, I'd love to read that. So first of all, NATO is not an entity, as far as I know, that is in the business of signing on and becoming parties to treaties. Although I will say that NATO's approach to space is very, very clear, that all of NATO's approach and engagements and activities will be fully in line with international law. So let me just say that. And as you well know, the number of signatories to the Outer Space Treaty that are also allies, and as I mentioned, partners is also quite relevant, really reinforces that message. So it almost goes without saying, given the fact that individual allies are the ones that make the decisions at 30 full consensus, but at the same time, NATO has declared it on its own that it is going to be fully in compliance with international law. As I mentioned during earlier in my remarks, NATO is not a norm-making body. It's not a norm-establishing body. It does not seek that role. But of course, the allies that sit here in Brussels also sit in the United Nations, also sit in various other bodies around the world that do address space. And so the reality is we can do a lot here to support those other efforts. I'll give you an example. We had a briefing not so long ago by some colleagues from Washington and from London that were talking about the responsible behaviors in outer space that is being pushed very strongly by the United Kingdom in the United Nations. Now, just talking about that here is nothing new because the UK can talk to our allies also in New York City. At the same time, it presents a different color, different flavor to that conversation within a political, military, security, and defense alliance than just in the UN, where it's a sort of broader conversation about international law. Moreover, it's a more intimate conversation, right? We're in a room of 30. And so we also shared at that time, the United States shared at that time, our intention to submit a resolution that basically encapsulated Vice President Harris's statement about the U.S. moratorium on direct descent anti-satellite testing. We introduced it at the UN. We were able to also discuss that, presented briefly here in Brussels. And so I think we have a very effective forum here for a lot of the coordination and work that I think we need to bring to other areas of space. But again, we're not a norm-setting organization. And as far as I know, and this is a very complex institution, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but I don't believe we had an example in which we're signing on as a party to an international treaty, so as an alliance. Now, regarding your LLM thesis, the legal ramifications of NATO, you know, the working within the international legal framework right now is one of those things where, as I said, we're bringing together all of these responsible parties already that are they're both fulfilling the OST and helping to establish these future norms to supplement that as sort of the Magna Carta of space law. And so I think, again, we have a role to play, but I think in some respects, the legal ramifications are more about us following and complying rather than doing anything that would in any way shape or force international law in space. So I hope that's helpful. Happy to do a follow-up when we get through other ones.
Great, sir. Thank you. And Keith has another question, but I want to cut in here just based on something that you said. You had mentioned Vice President Harris's announcement of the United States, right, ASAT moratorium, mentioned the UN General Assembly vote, mentioned discussions at NATO. Obviously, there have been some NATO countries that have individually, right, voluntarily kind of signed on to that moratorium, right? The United Kingdom, yes. France, Germany. If you can speak to the question, what are other kind of individual NATO states thinking about the moratorium? And do you believe that we could expect other NATO members to possibly individually sign on as well?
So great follow-up question. So first of all, you know, the Outer Space Treaty, and I should say, you know, efforts that are done at the United Nations in general, there's really sort of two sides to it, right? There's those that sign on in a practical fashion, and those that sign on in a symbolic messaging aspect. So, for example, when the Outer Space Treaty was signed in 1967, right, many countries signed on to it, but it basically limited and prescribed behavior for two countries, right? And so the countries that you just mentioned as having made their own statements are those that have or could deploy direct descent ASAT technologies. You know, not every member of the alliance has the same capabilities, nor do they need them. I mean, there's a complementarity that takes place with the various resources of the different allies. So part of international law is, you know, proactive, right? And part of it is through customary behavior. And so, you know, the vote at the UN being supplemented by a national declaration, sure, that's also great. Absolutely. I'm just not sure that for every country it's necessarily on their national agendas. You know, there are a lot of countries for whom space is important. They recognize it. They are contributors here at NATO to our discussions in significant ways. But in terms of domestic politics, it just isn't today's issue. So I'm just not sure it gets on the calendar, if you will, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you. And now to Keith's follow-up question. NATO as a collective defense organization is bound geographically and territorially, right, by the NATO treaty. Why is it reasonable to assume that collective self-defense in response to some sort of attack, maybe an armed attack, maybe something else in space, is acceptable, considering the impact this might have on the broader space environment, right? Or in other words, what would NATO bring over and above the legal rights, right, that an individual nation has to respond to that type of situation?
Well, I mean, now we're getting a little bit into the realm of conjectural, though, you know, I will say that the Washington Treaty, in referencing the UN Charter, I mean, it speaks to the right of individual defense as well as collective defense. And, you know, at this point, you get into a lot of scenario-based conversation about what is the nature of the incident, right? You know, does it come from space? Does it go to space? Is it within space? Does it cause this harm? Does it cause that harm? You know, a lot of these discussions you hear in academia, I don't cover cyber at all. I'm just familiar with it a little bit from my time at the Air Force Academy. Actually, this was a discussion while I was there. You know, if a malign actor hacks a power grid, is that an attack? If that hack on a power grid causes infrastructure shutdowns, malfunctions, failures that leads to a traffic accident that causes one fatality, is that an attack? Et cetera, et cetera. So you get attribution, but you also get intent, but you also get effect. So, you know, I don't want to get too much into the realm of conjecture of what different attacks could possibly be. Suffice it to say that as we made in our statement about the possibility, it's again part of the strategic communications that's designed to prevent this issue from even coming to a head. Now, as you mentioned, the Washington Treaty does have territoriality in its language. There is some interesting debate about how various aspects of that would sort of reconcile with one another, plus the aspect of space not really being contemplated at the time that certain agreements were signed. I would even go so far as to say that even the Outer Space Treaty has a lot of ambiguity, vagueness, and gaps, because at the time that it was developed, it was really, I mean, we had not yet set foot on the moon, and yet it was talking about things you could and could not do on other celestial bodies, right? So, you know, again, conjecture, you know, in an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of scenarios, there are some that would fall on one side or the other of the line, and those have to be made from a political, from a security, from a defense perspective, based on the facts.
So the next question comes from Major Gregory, and it involves a discussion of what you had mentioned regarding Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. And his question is, Major Gregory's question is, what do you think about an Article 5 invocation or the possibility of such an invocation in a situation like that which we see in Ukraine involving Starlink, right? So specifically, Starlink provides these telecommunications capabilities to Ukraine, which is not, right, a NATO member and therefore is not covered under Article 5. However, Starlink is a US company. And so if Russia was attacking or interfering in some way with the Starlink systems, what are your thoughts with respect to whether or not this could constitute an attack on either the United States or vis-a-vis, right, the licensing system, right, a United States-based asset, even though Russia itself might argue generally as it has, right, that it's attacking a Ukrainian capability and is not in fact targeting the United States?
Well, I mean, again, I think that this gets a little bit into conjecture because, you know, you're talking about the nature of an attack. So for example, Starlink has a ground-based receivers. If you're talking about an incident on the ground within Ukrainian territory that damages one of these receivers, I find it hard to believe that would really fall within the scope of the question. Regarding something in space, again, that's very hard to say because I don't mean to evade the question, but to imagine what the nature of the incident would help define the conversation thereafter. So to put a finer point on it, you probably read in the news not long ago that there had been an incident that led to an explosion in eastern Poland that actually led to the loss of life. That is directly connected to the conflict that was launched by Russia in Ukraine. But at the end of the day, each incident, each event is taken sort of on its merits. Again, you've got attribution, you've got intent, you've got effect. And so I think you've also got the fact that the goal is not to look for escalatory measures. The goal, first and foremost, in the current conflict that's taking place, is to end it. Right, is to get Russia out of Ukrainian territory and end this conflict, but it's not to escalate. It's to bring it down. So it's an interesting question. It's funny because when a lot of times when we talk about space, and this is getting sort of outside of NATO and more into sort of an academic legal framework, but a lot of times when we talk about space, folks like to look at terrestrial analogs, whether it's the Antarctic Treaty or the Law of the Seas or something like that. And you can try maybe to imagine that. So for example, I don't know, right now, it would also depend on the territory. So, if I'm trying to think of a really good example, if a state actor or a non-state actor were to put up some sort of obstacles in international waters that led to harm, whether deliberately placed or placed, and inadvertently causing some damage or destruction, how would countries react to that? So I think it's a little bit difficult to say what that would mean and what sort of response we would take. I also think when you get into private enterprise, it's another issue, right? I mean, again, I am no expert in maritime law, but I can imagine the big difference between a national navy ramming or striking a vessel from another national navy versus ramming a fishing boat from another country. We know that happens sometimes in the Western Pacific, and how countries respond to these incidents. So your guess is as good as mine. It's certainly some of the things that academics are thinking about, some strategists are thinking about in the Pentagon and other capitals, and just being prepared for if something happens and all the many things that could happen, what are the different option sets that we have to respond?
Our next question is from Mr. Mark Meyer. Mr. Meyer asks, how can NATO push or encourage their member states to further develop their own national space laws to better implement, right, the Outer Space Treaty and other outer space related guidelines, right, for responsible space activities, both in the sense of, right, NATO member states, public kind of civil space programs, and then their own private actors as well?
It's a great question. So again, NATO itself is not a norm-setting institution. A lot of work that we do with countries is done on a bilateral basis. I would argue that a lot of allies as well as partners have begun to establish pretty robust national legislation. I mean, Japan, Luxembourg is a leading nation when it comes to space law. So, and space capabilities for that matter, they contribute quite a bit to what we have collectively here at NATO. So, the Artemis Accords, which I mentioned previously, is, it's not being done here at NATO, nor should it be, but that is in a way helping to encourage allies, like-minded partners, and the international community to start thinking about space in a unified, agreed framework. What we can do, what we can't do, encouraging private enterprise, making sure that we are in compliance with the Outer Space Treaty and so forth. So, this wouldn't be the institution, this wouldn't be the forum to discuss that. We wouldn't have a session here in which we said, okay, here's commercial code this from country X, here's space activity law Y from country Z, and so we'd like everyone to take a look at it, bring it back to your capitals for drafting. It's just not really what we do here. But like I said, this is a forum. This is an excellent opportunity for intimate conversations about these important topics. And as I said, we talked about our moratorium here, brought it in resolution form to the United Nations. This was endorsed by our allies and the partners, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we could certainly continue to have those conversations through the Artemis Accords, dialogues, and others. So, it's the right people, it's just not the right place.
All right, so our next question comes from Mr. John Bergstresser. Mr. Bergstresser asks, all right, so NATO's approach, as you said, is to conform to existing international law and treaties. And so what he asks is, does this suggest that there might be a possibility of invoking Article 5, maybe under the NATO treaty, if a state were to violate Article 1 of INMOD, right, or the Environmental Modification Convention, by causing widespread debris that modifies or harms the space environment, right, as part of a military strategy? So the intentional environmental modification of an orbit via the creation of space debris, could that trigger Article 5 potentially?
I don't want to speak on behalf of even Washington on this topic, let alone all the other allies. It just doesn't sound like it's the match though that we're talking about. I mean, for example, when a nation engages in some behavior that causes pollution to the ocean, it's not deemed an Article 5 event, even though it could harm, territorial waters of a nation. I mean, again, the issue would be where's the nexus that would rise to that level. Again, you then get into these questions about attribution, intent, and effect. So, if Russia were to decide tomorrow, or any nation were to decide tomorrow, they were going to engage in a massive display of extraterrestrial capabilities that led to a bunch of debris floating around, then led to a Kessler effect cascade of damage to assets. I mean, if that wasn't the intent, talk about irresponsible behavior and long-term consequences for overall access to space, but just so NATO is going to be compliant fully with international law. That doesn't mean that it's a police force for Kyoto or other the Arctic Treaty or something like that. There's a difference between I drive within the speed limit. It doesn't mean I'm pulling people over. So it's a different sort of take on that, I think.
Our next question is from Mrs. A.K. Tolbert. A.K., great to see you on. Thank you for being here. And Mrs. Tolbert says, thank you so much for your presentation, sir. Was wondering if you could speak to how you see NATO and U.S. involvement in NATO balancing space as a tool of diplomacy, particularly in the context maybe of escalation or aggression in space. Or to put it another way, she says, I think space has a unique ability to bring states together and potentially to ease geopolitical tensions that other mediums or domains may not. I'm curious how NATO/US NATO sees its role in preserving and utilizing that ability when faced with potential conflict in the space domain.
So if I understand the question correctly, first of all, space. I agree with you. Space, the potential to use space for good is nearly limitless. Whether it be unexpected, unanticipated developments in science and technology that then bear fruit on Earth, environmental science, and so forth. That said, you know, I think we're talking about two different things. So, one, for example, I'll give you a good example, I think, of where space has already moved fruit in terms of diplomatic benefits for the United States. When we opened up the GPS system to commercial terrestrial use, that was non-military, right? Suddenly you opened up all manner of application and potential. Again, the phone in your pocket, the map in your pocket, that allow countries all over the world to benefit from it. And that, you know, I can't come up with a specific example, but I can imagine that suddenly, whether it be you know, fishermen or farmers in developing countries, or it be engineers building infrastructure, schools, highways, rail. This was a new tool that was suddenly, from one day to the next, immediately available publicly. I mean, of course, you eventually need to get something that can receive this, but it was immediately available, and it was, you know, it was space-based. It had an origin in space, and so I hope I'm not misunderstanding the question, but you know, the way we use space diplomatically is in a number of ways. I mean, not just here at NATO, by the way. I mean, bilaterally between allies and other countries, and in other fora like the United Nations through the Artemis Accords and others, we have the opportunity to bring in a very big and very diverse tent. You know, one of the things that I think the Biden administration is particularly proud of is two African countries just recently signed on to the Artemis Accords. Okay, Nigeria and Rwanda, if memory serves, signed on last month. I want to say it was in December. And so, looking at what can be done here in NATO, I mean, again, that's limited to alliance membership, partnership, but it does have broader benefits. I mean, for example, if you are building up partnership capabilities in certain parts of the world, you can help them establish better stability, prosperity, peace, security in that region in which they find themselves, whether it be Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, etc. But also, each of the countries here can certainly take the experience, the expertise, and the information we developed here, bring them back to their capitals, bring them back to other fora, and begin to develop them. I would say to draw a direct nexus to NATO, as well as the question at hand is, so again, with the discussion of the moratorium on direct ascent ASACs, this was a very helpful conversation here that, I mean, without the conversation, I'm sure there would have been a lot of support, but again, it was just an extra opportunity to have that discussion, hear from allies about their views on the topic, but not having massive space debris as a result of widespread adoption of this moratorium benefits all humanity as well. So there's lots of different ways, direct and indirect, that space can benefit others diplomatically, through security, also through prevention of conditions that would be dangerous, through the access to resources. I mean, when NATO does weather monitoring, a lot of that information just becomes open source, and that's going to help people. It's not like it's limited to the country. I mean, these are widespread geographic regions, and that information is shared. It's widely available, so that can help as well. So there's really almost limitless capacity.
So the last question currently, right in our Q&A box, is from Oluwadamilola Ogunjobi, and the question is, in your opinion, somewhat space related, but maybe more cyber related. So hopefully you can speak to it. In your opinion,
I'll do my best.
what is the what is the level of cyber preparedness in the event of a malware type attack on cloud computing systems or other platforms or infrastructure that might also affect, right, the space environment or space capabilities for NATO member states?
I mean, that's really beyond my expertise. Again, we talk regularly about resilience here at the Alliance. It's something we take very seriously across domains that include space, cyber, and the traditional air, land, and sea. I wish I could give some specifics. I'm just not aware of them. I know, again, that we do take it seriously. If you look at just open source reporting, you know that NATO does a lot to train and to think about and prepare for resilience in cyber as well as space, land, air, and sea. I mean, but it's really well beyond my area of expertise. I really do apologize. I can't share more on that. One thing I would say is that, you know, it's a very funny conversation sometimes, not just here at NATO, but in other areas where, you know, where is cyber and space, you know, essentially in the same breath, and where are they very, very distinct domains, areas of human activity, and, you know, sometimes it's very clear that they're quite separate, and sometimes it's not as clear. I mean, I think you point to a good example in your question where there's sort of an interrelatedness and interconnectedness. But overall, you know, the goal is to have that resilience built in for our societies, for our defense, for our deterrence, for our security across the domains. And it's just something that we are working on day and night here. So outside of my area of expertise, but
so do you have any closing remarks before we shut this down?
Well, so, you know, I just think it's great that that you're organizing this. I mean, I'm a big fan of the LTWRC series. I do share relevant videos with colleagues of mine at the State Department, in academia, here at NATO. I think it's great that everyone has joined today to think about this topic. There are certainly people who are thinking about it bigger than me because they're doing it in an academic, you know, dedicated way. And I think that that's great because that feeds back into the way we think about it here. I would absolutely encourage people to continue to think about, to work on, to publish. It gets read. That's really the takeaway message, is that we have an insatiable thirst for that industry and academia, private sector and commercial kind of thinking that we want to help inform us here. I mean, we are you know, blessed with incredibly talented staff, but we work across many different realms of human activity for security, deterrence, and defense. And you know, we rely on the work that's done outside of this building to help make sure the work done in the building is that much better. So, thank you.